I have the extreme pleasure of introducing a real treat to you, someone that's been on the front line or been next to, and also someone who's benefited from someone that's been on the front line for over 50 years and is still driving change even today. So, what am I talking about? I'm talking about Mr. Charles McAfee, FAIA, and Miss Cheryl McAfee, FAIA. So let me tell you a little bit about them. In 1963, Arthur Ashe became the first black tennis player selected for the United States Davis Cup. That same year, a 32-year-old African American raised in Wichita, Kansas, opened his firm that was Charles McAfee Architects and Planners, which over the years have become McAfee3. McAfee family, however, is very, very unique because not only was Charles McAfee elevated to the College of Fellows, obviously recognizing his significant impact on the profession and society, both his two daughters later received the same distinction. And both Cheryl McAfee and who we have joining us, Cheryl McAfee Duncan out of Dallas. They have made an indelible mark on the architecture industry, from residential properties to schools, airports, health facilities. Their portfolio is huge. Huge. They are also the only family with that distinction of having three members, a father and two daughters, as part of the College of Fellows. And over the decades, over those 50 years, even though we've come a long way, they have certainly faced discrimination of race, gender, and of course, other professional discrimination, and in response through their activism. With that said, I want to welcome Mr. McAfee and Charles to Design for Change. Welcome, both of you. How are you guys doing?
Doing great. Good morning.
All right. Mr. McAfee, you good?
I'm always doing good when I'm in company of talented young people.
We appreciate the opportunity to come and talk to students this morning. And we have a great perspective to share. My father, who celebrated his 88th birthday back in December, has seen lots of things in his years. And the things that I've seen in mine, how similar, but yet how different they are. And we'll share some of those experiences with you today. And so, Dad, we were talking about earlier, about what inspired you to become an architect. Can you tell the students a little bit about that?
Well, my hero early in my days was my daddy and my big brother. During World War II, my big brother decided he wanted to make model airplanes. And that was the first time I ever read a set of plans. So I read a set of plans how to build model airplanes. And I was in the 4th or 5th grade by then, maybe. And I kept it up and kept it up. And when I got to another segregated school, we had segregated schools up through the 8th grade. When I moved to Leoverture School to go to the 7th and 8th grade, they taught mechanical drafting. So I took this course in mechanical drafting, T-square and triangle. Most of you don't even know what those are. But what happened was, that's where I got really excited about doing drafting. And then I had a woodworking class, and I learned how to build a few little things, which I still have. And then when I went to high school, I took mechanical drawing, my sophomore, junior, and senior year. By the time I was in my senior year in drafting, I finished the whole year's work in the first semester. So the second semester, my instructors hired me out to do house plans. And I was doing house plans at home for $10. I draw a floor plan, a foundation plan, and elevations, and one wall section for $10. And I was making a lot of money. But then, as a young man, when I finally decided I wanted to be an architect, I wanted to go to University of Kansas to major in architecture. And I made All-State in basketball in junior high school. But then when I got to high school, they only had one black player on the team, so that wasn't me. So I never played high school. I was good enough to be on the tennis team, but they practiced on a private course, so I never got to play tennis. So all of a sudden, when my sister, who graduated with honors from Wichita University, had been selected by Boeing to do a quick aeronautical drafting class, and they sent her to KU in Lawrence, Kansas. She came back. The story was you couldn't go to the movie theaters except in designated areas. You couldn't eat in the restaurants, and nobody played sports. Well, the same thing was also at Kansas State University. Couldn't live in the dormitories. So we looked for a place, and the closest place where we could find where I could go and get back home if need be was the University of Nebraska, straight north out of Wichita to Lincoln, Nebraska. I went to Lincoln, Nebraska, and that's where I first enrolled in architecture.
It was great. So for me, I had a similar story, but of course, my father, architect Charles McAfee, and he came to my second grade class and he started talking about what he does and what inspires him to be an architect. And I was so proud. You know, here's my dad, and I wanted to be like my dad because he was so passionate about architecture. And the similar case for me is in the 8th grade, the women or the girls at school, we all had to take home ec. We had to take cooking and sewing, and all the boys took shop. Well, there were several of us who wanted to take shop. I knew I wasn't going to be a good cook, and I knew I wasn't going to be able to sew anything. But girls were not allowed to take shop in the 8th grade. So I had a friend who petitioned the court to allow her to take shop because it was discriminatory. And all of us were just in awe that she was able to do that. And so I had to wait until high school to take drafting. And back then, we had elevated, if you will, from a T-square to a parallel bar. And in the parallel bar, we, you know, the guys who came in on the ninth grade obviously had skills that those of us, and there was only 2 women that were in the class, you know, so they had an advantage over the rest of us because they knew how to draw. I knew how to draw because, again, I worked in the office. I worked in the office, played in the office as a kid, walked on job sites with my dad, my sisters, and I grew up around the profession and have always been interested and passionate about it. But there were always these elements around that kind of inhibited or made us choose a different direction to go. So I started off at Kansas State University. I was there pre-design, but of course I'm also following my father, Charles McAfee, and my sister, Cheryl McAfee, at Kansas State. And Cheryl had just come back from Harvard. She was working at TAC with her internship there in Boston. And it was her senior year and it was my freshman year. And we had they got us confused. Oh, there's two of them. And I have always wanted to be my own person. From the moment I was born, I was Charles. I'm just Charles. So, and my dad is laughing because it's true. And so I had a difficult time because everybody kept comparing me to either my dad or my sister. And I wanted to be me. And in the course of I only did pre-design at Kansas State, and then I transferred to the University of Nebraska. And I was in Nebraska barely 2 months. And I called my dad and I said, Daddy, there's only 295 Black students out of 22,000 at the University of Nebraska. And he said, well, that's 290 more than when I was there. And so he always had a sense of humor, but I was horrified because Kansas State had, maybe 800, almost 1,000 out of some 20,000 students. So we saw each other, and it wasn't like we were the only one in class. And at Nebraska, I was definitely by myself, and I could feel it. And we'd make a stop by the Union just to be able to see each other and know that we were there. And I went to, and I finished at Nebraska. But my experience at Nebraska was very similar to my father's. And even though I graduated in 83 and he graduated in, Dad, 57, 58?
58.
58. Our stories are similar because when I was there was an art student who hung a Black figure from a tree. And I was leaving the architecture building, heading to parking lot, which was next to the stadium. And you pass 3 buildings and they're all pretty much lined up. They're identical, they look alike. And in between the buildings, you can see toward the road. And all I could see was the shadow of someone looking like they were hanging from a tree. And we had just had a conversation with student government and the fact about the Klan being very active in central Nebraska and how we needed to be very careful about what we said or did on campus and that kind of thing. So I was scared. I ran to my car like somebody was chasing me. And I got in my car and, this is before cell phones. I'm in my car, I drive home, I get on the phone. One of my best friends, Charlene Maxey, her dad was a police officer, Albert Maxey. I called, I said, this is what I saw, I'm scared. It ended up on the cover of the Daily Nebraskan the next day. And the art student said, well, I don't see it as racist. I see it as art. And that's when I knew I needed to get out of Nebraska. I need to get out of Nebraska. Dad has a similar story.
Well, my brother drove me up to Lincoln and dropped me off freshman week. And I promised my mom and dad no sports because I had physics, chemistry, and calculus my freshman semester. I went over to the tennis court. Nobody would play tennis with me. I was walking back by the gym and I heard a basketball. I went in, I was looking. There were 2 guys playing 2 guys. And another guy came down and said, hey, you play basketball? I said, yeah. Come on, we need a 3rd guy. Okay. So I started playing basketball. There was a guy in the stands. We played for a half hour or so, and he came down and he said, you go to school here? And I said, yeah. He said, you coming out for the basketball team? I said, no. He said, I think you ought to come out for the basketball team. I said, who are you? My name is Harry Good. I'm the basketball coach. My ego got out of place. So I went out for the basketball team. Freshmen couldn't play varsity those years, and this was what then was called the Big 7, then the Big 8, then the Big 12. And so freshmen couldn't play varsity. So I came home for Christmas. my father, Arthur McAfee Sr., was sitting in his lounge chair reading Sports Illustrated. And there was an article in Sports Illustrated that he started reading to me as I came in the door. It said, Nebraska's outstanding freshman guard, Charles McAfee. My dad looked at me and said, who is that? I said, well, Daddy, I was going to tell you and Mom, they're going to give me a partial scholarship because I made the team. So you tell Mom. He said, oh, no, I'm not telling your mother anything. My mom was back washing dishes. She's about 5'2". And I went back there and I started telling her. And I told her what I had done. She very slowly turned and looked up at me. And I could almost hear the words coming out of her mouth. Go out in that backyard, cut me the biggest switch you could cut, and bring it in here to me. But she didn't. And so they let me go ahead and play. Well, I made the varsity. We played the first 2 games at home, and then we were supposed to make the first trip. My name wasn't on the travel squad. I said, why am I not on the travel squad? So we're going south, and you can't eat in the restaurants, can't stay in the hotels, and you can't play in the arenas. I said, well, why did I go out for this? So they left me at home. So then I'm now in my 2nd year in architecture, and I got my freshman numeral on. And the dean came in and chastised me because I had my freshman leather sweater on. We don't have any athletes in the architecture department. I was the only Black student in architecture, the only one. So I'm fighting architecture problems, I'm fighting athletic problems. I was good enough to make the tennis team, but all the tennis matches during the early semester were all down south, and I couldn't go to any of those. So I'm fighting this, what I thought was up north was really up south, because all they did was agreed to everything the southern states were doing. So I kept on, and all of a sudden I got this notice that I had been drafted. This is during the Korean War. I'm being drafted out of school. They sent me to Kansas City, stayed in a segregated hotel to go get my physical exam between Christmas and New Year's. And on March the 6th, in the middle of 2nd semester, I had to report for duty. So I blew the whole 2nd semester, grades and everything, because I had to drop out to go to the military. They put us on buses and sent us to Camp Polk, Louisiana. They wouldn't feed us in the main dining rooms on the way down, so I didn't eat. And I finally got out of there, and they sent me to Germany. The one thing about what I had done, I had studied all my architecture classes. So all of the books were all about European architecture. I made the European All-Star basketball team, and I got to travel the zone all over. So I saw Notre Dame, St. Paul in London, and Parliament in London, and St. Peter's in Rome, and all these other places that I'd already studied. And I have a tremendous slide possession of all of those places that Charles and Cheryl, once they were able to go, had already seen them. But it was coming back to school, which was really difficult. I was lucky enough to marry this marvelous woman named Gloria Winston, and she had graduated from Howard University in Washington, D.C., and did further study in opera at University of Indiana, and came to Lincoln. Only job she could get was working as a clerk in a driver's license bureau. Well, we had a little apartment. We were trying to find a bigger one. And she made this contact over the phone. Woman said, oh, yes, of course. Well, when Gloria showed up with a couple of her workers with what little furniture we had, the woman looked at Gloria and said, oh, no, we don't rent to you people. So here I am up south again, fighting all kinds of things. Well, by now, Black people are now playing in the Big Seven, Big Eight, because there was a guy by the name of Wilt Chamberlain who did more to integrate athletics in college than anybody. He was 7'1". He got 200 offers to come play from places like University of Texas and every place else. It would be great if you could be the first one to play. He could have been polka dot as good as he was, and they'd have let him play. But he went to the University of Kansas, and KU went all the way to the national finals. So all of a sudden, we got more Black kids playing football and basketball, baseball, and running track. So that started to level things off a little bit. But now my senior year, I'm doing my thesis, which is a hospital. I turned in 17 sheets of drawings, fine line ink drawings. And I went to California because I wanted to go to LA to work. I interviewed for the Welton Beckett firm, which was the biggest firm in Los Angeles. Richard Northrup, who had been run out of Europe by Hitler, and Paul Williams, the great Black architect, who was the first African American to become a fellow of the American Institute of Architects. All three of them offered me a job. So I go back to Nebraska, and I got an incomplete with 17 sheets of drawings. Nobody else got an incomplete, and nobody else failed. So I go in trying to find somebody. My drawings were laying on the dean's desk. So I said, "What is the problem?" He threw this sheet of paper to me. He had hired a freshman design professor who had just graduated from Harvard. I didn't take any classes from him, didn't even know him. But the list said, "This is a list of architects unhappy with the way architecture is taught at the University of Nebraska." My name was second from the top of the list. I said, "I don't know anything about this." The dean looked at me and said, "If you're unhappy here, why don't you learn how to speak Spanish and go to Puerto Rico?" I looked at the dean and I said, "I want to tell you, I want you in my way or nobody else. I'm going to graduate from this school if I have to do it standing on my head. Do you understand what I'm saying?" I graduated at the top of my class. And by the time I did, I had all these offers. And I came home to Wichita. And there was a guy, his mother and my mother sang in a church choir. He came home to visit his mother, and they live right around the corner from where we live. And he came home on vacation. He came around to see me. He said, "What are you going to do?" And I told him about all these jobs he had, and I had offers. He said, "Well, I knew you couldn't get a job here." I said, "Why is that?" He said, "I tried, nobody would hire me." He was in World War II, finished at Kansas State, and nobody would hire him in Kansas. So he ended up working in Indiana. So Monday morning, I decided, hell, I'll just go out and look and see. So I went to a couple of places. The third place I went to, this one guy looked at me and says, "Your stuff is really good." I said, "Well, I worked for a firm in Lincoln my last 2 years, so I have a lot of practical experience." He said, "I'm getting ready to go on vacation, but my partner will be back on Wednesday. So I want you to come back on Wednesday. I'm going to leave him a note that you're going to come by. So you come by Wednesday." So I thought, okay, well, I could get me a job in Wichita. I almost didn't go back on Wednesday. So I went back on Wednesday, and the guy says, "Yeah." I said, "My partner showed me your stuff and says, you're really good." He said, "And we'd like to hire you." He said, "I was kind of worried about my partner." I said, "Why were you worried about your partner?" "Well, he's from Oklahoma." Well, Oklahoma was one of those places where I couldn't play basketball or tennis. And I said, "Where are you from?" And he said indignantly, "I'm from Texas." I couldn't play there either. So this is the firm that hired me. And I worked there for about a year and got a new school superintendent, stopped all the schoolwork. That's all we had. So they laid me off. They laid me off that morning. I had a job that afternoon. So I went to work for another firm, doing all kind of stuff. You have to wait till you've worked for a registered architect for 3 years before you can take the exam. So I kept, working for them. And in the meantime, I took the exam, passed the exam, and I had one little house. And I came home that night. I had a drafting table setting up in a utility room. The drafting table was as wide as the utility room. And I drew 7 sheets of drawings that I never changed. And early in the morning, my wife came in and said, "What are you doing?" I said, "I'm drawing this house." She said, "What are you singing?" I said, "Singing? I wasn't singing anything." She said, "Yes, you were." I said, "What was I singing?" "You were singing, 'Design, Charlie, design.'" And I said, "Oh, we got the house built." I ended up helping to build the house. And we won one of the 7 top national design awards to be given in Washington, D.C. Didn't have enough money, so I borrowed the money from my mom and dad for my wife and I to fly to D.C. And I didn't know what else was going on because they didn't send me other information. So when we landed at the airport, there was a public address announcement that said, "Would arriving passenger Charles McAfee please go to a paging phone for a message from Dr. Robert C. Weaver." Well, I thought that was significant because Dr. Weaver was to become the first Black secretary in the United States president's cabinet. So told us what to do the next morning. So my wife and I, after we have breakfast, we go to their office. We walk in the door. And there's a white lady there sitting there, the receptionist. She looks up at us and she says, are you Mr. McAfee?" And I said, "Yes." The woman jumped up and ran out of the room. And I looked at my wife and I said, "What's going on?" She was dragging another white woman out. And they're both standing there holding hands talking about Dr. Weaver is going to be so proud. I still have no idea what's going on. She says, "One of the award winners is back getting his pictures taken. And once he gets through, you will go in and get yours taken." So I go back, the door opens, and this guy walks out and looks at me and he says, "Are you one of the award winners?" And I said, "Yes." And he smiled at me and he says, "I remember those days." I started to ask him if he had to borrow the money from his daddy to make the trip to Washington to get this award. But I later found out that I.M. Pei, daddy, was the president of the Bank of China and had come to the United States and graduated from Harvard and was working for the biggest developer in the country. So I.M. offered, Gloria and I were going to go to New York after we left Washington. So he invited us to his office. We did that. But when I was feeling now so good, because I found out that who else won. And I said, the one thing I'd like to do now is Mrs. Errol Saarinen was going to be the monitor of the awards. The doors open on one side of the hall, and the doors open on the other side of the hall. Mrs. Saarinen walked straight out, and I walked straight out, and I introduced myself to her. I said, "Boy, this is great. Things are really going good." So all of a sudden, there were about 2,000 people in this auditorium. And they had I.M. Pei's Kips Bay in New Jersey. They had Mies van der Rohe's Twin Towers on the lakeshore in Chicago, and Skidmore, Owens and Merrill with an elderly retired community in California. And then the screen said, the R.A. Eubanks residence, 12,000 or 1,200 square foot house. Wichita, Kansas, architect Charles McAfee. Well, you could hear 2,000 people say, "Who? Where?" Because nobody, all of us, I had publicity in every architectural magazine in the country. And all of a sudden I had jobs from Maine to Texas. So I'm on the road from here on out. I could have never survived in Wichita, Kansas, unless I got on an airplane and found it. People ask me what was my marketing strategy. I said, my marketing strategy is very close to being a Kansas prairie hawk. I'd be up in the sky, circling and circling and circling and circling till I saw the biggest rabbit I could find, and then I'd go get it. So then I had jobs in Miami, in Atlanta, in Beaumont, Texas, and Tulsa, Oklahoma, and all over every place. And I stayed on the road every week, every week. I'll tell you one real quick little story. I had this client where I did this second house for, who was a classmate of mine at Nebraska, named Lloyd Williams. Lloyd would call me on Sunday morning complaining about his contractor wasn't building his house right. Well, we had just dug the foundations. I said, Lloyd, I'm certain he's doing it right. It's all right. You got to fly down here. So I'd go out, get on a plane, I'd fly down to Tulsa, check everything out. Everything was fine. Next Sunday, Lloyd would call me again. And I keep trying to cut him off. Everybody in the house is asleep, I thought. I said, Lloyd. And I'd say, damn it, Lloyd. For years, my daughters would remind me, damn it, Lloyd. So that was their first real introduction to a client having a problem with his architect.
We also started this little cuss jar so we could save money to buy a dishwasher. Needless to say, we got a dishwasher. So, Dad, tell us, what were, one of your favorite projects?
I don't have a favorite project. Every project I've done is important because most of them were different. So each one, the first one that won 2 or 3 design awards, both local and national. Then I got projects for the Wichita Eagle newspaper, which I won a design award for. Then I got a project for a small office building, which I won a design award for. I won design awards 7 years in a row, my first 7 years in business. And it just kept up. I did a neighborhood swimming pool in the park, which was the park Black people could only go to in Wichita. And I did the swimming pool and won a design award for it, which that pool is now named after me. But that was the way things went. I would take Cheryl, Pam, and Charles to all the design awards ceremonies. Well, I won a design award for the museum, the Ulrich Museum and McAfee Art Center at Wichita State. Well, I'd been taking them to these really fancy restaurants and things where they'd have the awards. Well, this one was going to be at a Boy Scout camp. I had never heard of this place. We went up there and a lizard ran across the sidewalk. My wife said, I'm not staying here. So we left and went back. But anyway, we won the design award, won 5 design awards for the McKnight Art Center at Wichita State University. The next year, we were back at a downtown business club in Topeka, Kansas, and they gave out 6 design awards, and I won 3 of the 6. But the worst thing that made it even worse was Ralph Rapson was the design critic. He said, I have a question I want to ask. Who did Niles Children's Home in Kansas City? And I said, I did. He said, explain to me why the arrangement on the site. I said, well, the grant was that the kids would have to maintain on this site or they'd lose the grant. So I built an L-shaped building around the original building, then moved the kids into the L-shaped building, tore down the original building, then put the administration center. He said, I wish I'd understood that. You would have won the top design award. Nobody spoke to me. You can't imagine. Only Black architect in Wichita, Kansas, and Kansas City, and the whole state win 7 design awards. My God. Well, anyway, so that was just the way it happened.
So one thing, Dad, you didn't tell them was when you got the first design award, what year was that?
It was 1960, I'm sorry, 1970.
1970. So one thing that the firm has done in our 56 years is we do a lot of municipal work. And I think the reason that we do a lot of municipal work because of the impact it has on society and the people that use the facilities. So we do a lot of libraries, we do a lot of schools, we've done recreation centers. You know, we have had a great opportunity to explore various projects. And I think one thing about social justice is how architecture impacts society. And so as architects, we have an opportunity to make the places that we have, that we use, that other people use better. And definitely in our communities. Because especially when I first moved to Dallas, south of town, you wouldn't have good stores, you wouldn't have good grocery stores, you had tons of liquor stores. And it was almost like Black people didn't spend any money. And now you can go south and there are lots of grocery stores, there's lots of clothing stores, there's lots of restaurants, but there's still a void in some areas that are displaced and unfortunately disfranchised. And so as architects, we have an opportunity to build better housing, to build better facilities for the community at large to have a benefit from. The Samuel Grand Rec Center that we renovated here in Dallas was a shelter for Katrina when people were displaced from New Orleans. And fortunately for us, we had just renovated those restrooms. Otherwise, they would have had all hundreds of people in there and it only had 2 restrooms. And when I say restrooms, I mean 2 toilets in each of those restrooms, the men's and the women's, and 2 showers. So it was very limited. But what was fantastic about the Samuel Grand project was the tennis center, because the tennis center was the largest tennis center in Texas. It had 20 courts. And in 1964, Arthur Ashe brought the Davis Cup to Texas. And they played on Samuel Grand, and they created courts 1 and 2 into the Grand Court where they played, and the US team won the Davis Cup. And it was amazing. Now there's 2 stories. You hear one where everyone, the city of Dallas contributed to making this happen. But you also have to realize that in 1964, there were still lots of places, especially country clubs where a lot of these tennis tournaments were played, that did not accept Blacks. And so what the city of Dallas and the United States Tennis Association there in Dallas did, Dallas Tennis Association, was that they wanted to bring the Davis Cup to Dallas. It couldn't be at Dallas Country Club, so it had to be at Samuel Grand Tennis Center. And so we had a great opportunity to build the new tennis center, and it actually has a kiosk, a honor of Arthur Ashe there on the property as a part of the public art piece. So we're very grateful for that. Dad, I'm looking at the comments in the chat, and that's why I was laughing earlier, because someone asked, how long did it take to get the dishwasher with the contributions from the cuss jar?
Well, let me tell you something else. you know, the story about Arthur Ashe, which is so unique. And we have so many projects like that. But one of the projects that I want to tell you about was Jackson Mortuary. The Jacksons were in the third generation, and the third generation were twin brothers who we grew up together, played baseball together, played basketball together, and they were moving across town, and so we did their mortuary. So I'm getting ready to hand Mr. and Mrs. Jackson the contractor's contracts to build a building. And I don't know, for some reason, I said, Mr. Jackson, have you gotten your loan from the bank? And Mr. Jackson looked at me and said, don't you know they don't loan us any money? I said, what? Now they're in third generation, very successful, own tons of property. All their Cadillacs were brand new. Didn't owe anybody anything. I talked him into going to the bank to borrow the money. The bank turned him down. Said, well, the reason we turned him down is that if Mr. Jackson decides he doesn't want to be in the mortuary business, what are we going to do with it? And laughed. We went downstairs to the banking floor. Mr. Jackson said, wait a minute. We walked over to the teller's counter. Young lady smiled. Hi, Mr. Jackson, what can I do for you? He says, give me all of my money out of this bank in cash. We walked out of that bank with a grocery sack. I never did know how much was in there. We walked out of that bank with a grocery stack full of $100 bills. And Mr. Jackson was so angry because of that. And these were the kind of things that even my clients would fall into. When I did the newspaper project, the guy who owned the newspaper, when he hired me, nobody knew that he had hired a Black architect to do his work. So I did the first part of it, which was the third floor addition. And then I did the very large addition to the east of the building, and there my sign was up on the wall on the main street in Wichita. He got this phone call and he called me up and he said, can you have lunch with me tonight? I said, wait a minute. I looked at my, yeah, I'm free. Meet me at my club, you know, the one you can't belong to. So I met him downtown at the downtown businessmen's club. He was just finishing a scotch and water. And we went inside to sit down. He had ordered a second one. I said, what's the matter with you? He said, 5 of my friends, the top business people in Wichita, called a meeting on me. And I'm going like, I don't know who's crazy enough to call a meeting on this guy. But anyway, he said, when I walked into the doors at the Wichita Country Club, they all walked over to me, didn't even offer me a drink. One of them said, Brown, what do you mean hiring a nigger to do your work? Britt Brown looked at him and said, wait a minute. He said, first of all, it's my money. He said, and second of all, the nigger, as you call him, is the best architect in this town. He said, I went out and got in my car and I drove around and drove around. I was so mad last night. I almost called you last night. I said, Britt, you should have called me. Nobody says this to my face, but there'll be places I go, like I went out Western Kansas for a couple of jobs. They looked at me like I had a tail. And I've never done any work in rural Kansas. So I just always got on a plane and went all over every place where I went. That was basically the way we survived and got the reputation that we got. Before we go much further, I want you to go online and I want you to look at our website, which is McAfee, MCAFEE, the number 3.com. And you'll see a lot of stuff of what it is we're doing. I want you to do that. I want you to go over to something called products. The products are about the McAfee modular housing system, which we are getting ready to create all over again.
Oh my goodness, in the chat, there's so many questions.
Yeah, yeah, I can help with that.
Okay, thanks, Garfield.
I'll ask. Yeah, we have quite a few. One question in particular, I want to go back um, to what Gary asked in terms of what advice would you give to interns now, young architects who are not quite licensed, particularly minority architects trying to achieve some of what you know, may still be having some of those same struggles. What what advice would either one of you give to them?
Well, I can say for me, um, experience is everything. And you want to be able to work for a company where you have an opportunity to go to meetings, to go out on job sites, and not to just draw, because drawing is part of it, but also being able to go out on job sites, because you have to be able to understand exactly what it is that you're drawing and understand how it's built. Some of this is not taught in college, which is a whole other discussion. But I think it's important, especially as an employer, and I have young students come and all they know how to do is CAD. And when you're trying to teach someone and help them to understand how a building goes together, it's part of architecture. I don't know how you can teach architecture school and not instill an understanding about how a building goes together. So I think knowledge and skill is important. Also, for me, when I got married and I moved to Dallas, I had worked in my father's firm, and only my father's firm, since I was in school. And so ending up in the big pond of HKS here in Dallas, there were only maybe 5 Blacks in all of 500 that were there in the office. And I was working with John Chase's office at the time. And so we were there as the minority participant. And for those of us who own our own firms, you know, it gives you an opportunity to be a part of a big project, but you also don't want them to minimize your role or your significance.
Right.
But take each project as an opportunity to learn something new. I've been at this in Dallas for 25 years, and I still learn every day. You're just not going to reach that point where you know everything. And
Gotcha. All right, Mr. McAfee, I'm not going to ask you the same question because your daughter did such an awesome job inspiring with the answer. But I'm going to take some liberty as the host and kind of take us back to the social justice kind of theme. I know in previous conversations, we've talked quite a bit, you and I, and your daughters, all are just amazing. But we've had conversations too about your direct involvement, Mr. McAfee, in activism back in the 60s. Brown versus the Board of Education, and then some of the reprisal that your daughters received back then directly from your activism early on. So as an architect, why did you feel, Mr. McAfee, the need to get involved with social justice movements back in the 60s rather than just being the great architect that you are?
Well, first of all, when Brown versus Board of Education happened, we actually bused our children, all 3 of them, to integrate the schools. And we did that on purpose. My wife was now teaching schools, and in a segregated school that got integrated with a lot of problems. And I ended up managing the political campaign for the first Black to be elected on the Wichita School Board, not on the Wichita School Board, but on the Wichita City Council. I was on Andy Young's committee to elected mayor of Atlanta. I did a lot of those kind of things because it needed to be done. There were times when Dr. King got killed, the black mayor of Wichita at that time and me, we spent 80% of our office time trying to calm the city down. So it was just those kind of things that you had to do. Architecture to me is something that you do that if you do it well, it transcends all the foolishness. And that's been my theme all along, is that I do a project that will transcend racism, sexism, and all that foolishness. Someone sent a note to you saying, what was my proudest moment in architecture? My proudest moment in architecture was the day that I stood in Denver, Colorado, with one arm around one daughter and one arm around the other daughter. Well, the two of them now had joined me as fellows of the American Institute of Architects. We're the only family, to my knowledge, that's been accomplished. The beautiful part about all of this is that we are in a profession that transcends just the science, but it's about living. How do we meet President Biden's desire to create 100 million affordable housing units? We intend on helping that by recruiting some of the people who are looking at this, because we're looking to build 10 modular manufacturing plants on historic Black colleges and campuses. Just think about that for a while. But that's why I want you to look at that website and see what the system looks like. It's won 4 or 5 design awards. But it's so important because our profession is the human profession. It transcends what the doctors do, what the lawyers do, what the politicians do. We encompass it all. That's why it is so important that we do that. A project that we're doing now, that we're putting together, is called the Gordon Parks Creative Center. It's not a museum. What it's about, here is a Black man in rural Kansas who never got a high school degree, but now had over 50 honorary degrees from the major colleges and universities in the country. But it's about how do you do art, photography, filmmaking, music, color photography, ballet. He did all of these things from a little town in Kansas called Fort Scott. So don't limit yourself where you're from. Read stuff like Search for Other Suns, which talks about the Great Migration out of the South to where most of our families came from. And Isabel Wilkerson, when she wrote that, she gave 3 examples. What would have happened if Mr. and Mrs. Owens had never gone to North? Would there ever been a Jesse Owens? If Mr. and Mrs. Russell had never gone to Oakland, would there have ever been a Bill Russell? But then the one I liked the most was this very talented Black surgeon who was the top surgeon in the military in Europe, came back to Louisiana and couldn't practice in the hospitals. So he went west. The story says he moved next door to the great Black architect, Paul Williams. I used to go, Paul would take me to the baseball games when I'd go to LA. So you got to understand, I was walking on tall cotton, just being in Paul Williams's company.
All right, Mr. McAfee, that's awesome. And actually, we have Charles' sister Cheryl on the call as well. Cheryl, I don't know if you want to turn on your video camera, because I think both of you can answer this next question. And that's Cheryl, and I see Cheryl's popping up down there. There she goes. Everyone, I'd like to introduce you to Cheryl McAfee, FAIA as well, Charles' sister and Charles' daughter. So probably the first time in a long time, the 3 of you has kind of been in one room with all of this COVID going on. But my question to the two of you, we can start with Charles, is how has your father's activism, your experiences, how has that really shaped you as a professional, as an architect, as a person?
My parents, both my parents were always involved, always moving forward. Um, Even with my mother was like the silent champion. Um, she could go in and, just her presence and her persona, people loved her, but they respected her. And she was very direct, very knowledgeable, very smart, and knew how to communicate with people for them to be able to understand and exactly what she was doing. And so she took a different perspective. My father was much more vocal and very out there, and people knew, when my dad was angry. And sometimes we'd be like, Dad, it's okay, but he was making a point, and he'd make a point, and he'd make a very strong point that this is what we need to do, because if we sit silent, nothing is going to happen. If we sit silent now, nothing is going to happen. As kids, we experienced a lot of racism. As a college student, experienced racism. As an adult, now in the 2000, experience racism. But we can't dwell there, because we have to move forward. We have to continue to reach out and go above and beyond these people whose sole attempt is to drag us down and to keep us in our place. And so my parents, my grandparents have always motivated us to not only do what we do, which is architecture, but also to be involved.
I just wanted to say that I think um, I think it takes a village, as we often say. Well, because we were so involved in politics, Daddy was, and my family was in many different ways. And I think actually all of us are part of the political process. We're either part of it because we don't do anything, or we're part of it because because we do something. Complacency is still a position. And so if you do nothing, you're still a part of politics. So, but we were very much engaged. He was engaged. And so I think that has been an inspiration in my life. Because he's still very active. He's still, and that can be making phone calls. And I think one of the things that they taught me, I think the word would be fearless, is trying to be fearless.
Absolutely.
And that's something that I fight with myself all the time, is to have courage and to be fearless. And sometimes we just have to fight through those, I call them demons in your mind, which tell you that you can't do something, or you don't make that phone call, or you procrastinate. Those are things that pull us down. And so I think it's just important that you always have somebody to reach out to. I think we were very fortunate as children to just have an incredible family nucleus, wonderful grandparents, wonderful parents, aunts and uncles and cousins who are and were very amazing, and fought in their own ways and provided leadership in different ways, even if it was running for class president, or in high school, or or leading things, in many aspects. So so now it would be getting involved in NOMA and making a difference there. Now there's that MOU that we have with the AIA, but getting involved in a lot of different things. I mean, Daddy was involved in open housing. We had I just remember his office became the location where the Secretary of Housing sent people there to do legislation for open housing, so that we could live and work in the same areas as white people. So it's, we still are talking about equitable communities. We're still talking about access to health care. We're still talking about things, I was in a meeting very early this morning about activism. We're writing postcards right now and we're trying to get over, at least 1,000 cards out to legislators about voting in Georgia, because there are 24 amendments in the legislature right now to try to stop people from voting, to suppress the vote, when there's, of course, no indication that there is voter fraud. So, doubling up on your on licensing. So if you think there's nothing you can do, you can pick up the phone, you can go on the internet, you can find the phone number, you can email these state senators and these state legislators right now and tell them you're against any of those amendments. So activism isn't just necessarily go taken to the streets. It's taken to the pen and the paper, and keeping abreast of what's going on and staying relevant. So there's always something we can do. And as architects and as individuals, there's a lot we can do. And that's one of the things that I learned from my fathers.
I think that is awesome. I think we really get a good sense from the three of you on how that intersection of architecture and activism and social justice, now inherently it becomes everyone's responsibility to fight injustice. And it's uniquely, obviously, unique for us as African Americans. So I hate to end the session. Mr. McAfee, I'm gonna leave it with you for the last word. If there's anything you want to our young scholars to hear, this is your chance, sir, for the last word as we wrap up.
I want to say something to you. I don't drink, I don't smoke, I've never done any drugs. The only thing I get high on are brilliant young people. So keep up the work, young folks that have been listening to us today.